By the third week of June, our community pool had been closed to every household except one for what amounted to nearly 11 consecutive weeks, blocked off with an exclusive reserved use sign. While I watched the board president's family and their guests use it almost daily through the gap in the privacy hedge, separating my own backyard from the amenity area. All while my own kids splashed around in a plastic kiddie pool, because the community pool we paid over $400 a year in dues to access sat, most days, entirely empty except for her. My name is Desmond Achterberg Nkemelu. I live in Fairhollow Ridge, a community of about 220 homes, and the woman at the center of this story is Priscilla Wentworth Ashby, who had served as our HOA board president for just over 2 years by the time this situation reached its peak. I want to walk you through how this escalated gradually, because it did not begin as the outright, months-long exclusive reservation it eventually became. It started, according to what several longtime residents told me once I began asking questions, with what seemed like a reasonable enough practice. Priscilla occasionally reserving the pool for a few hours on weekends for what she described as board planning sessions, or community event preparation. A practice that, while mildly inconvenient, didn't strike most people as worth objecting to given how infrequent it initially seemed. Over the 2 years of her tenure, though, that occasional reservation pattern had crept steadily wider, first to full weekend days, then to entire weeks during peak summer months, until, by the summer this story takes place, the pool had effectively become something close to a private amenity for her own family, reserved under a rotating series of vague official-sounding justifications, ongoing maintenance evaluations, insurance liability reviews, board strategic planning, that somehow always seemed to require the pool to remain closed to everyone except Priscilla and whoever she'd invited that particular day. I want to tell you about the specific moment I decided to actually push back, because it happened on a particularly hot Saturday in late June, watching my own kids, Elian and Rowan, splash miserably in a kiddie pool that had grown too small for them years ago, while I could hear, clearly, the sound of a pool party happening less than 200 feet away, through the hedge separating our property from the community amenity area. I called the HOA management office that same afternoon, asking directly why the pool had been closed to general residents for what I now realized, once I actually thought back through the summer, had been nearly the entire season. The response I got, from a management office representative who sounded genuinely uncertain herself, was that all pool scheduling decisions fell under the board president's discretionary authority regarding amenity area management, and that any specific questions about the current closure would need to go through Priscilla directly. I want to walk you through the conversation I had with Priscilla herself, because her response revealed, I think, exactly how confident she'd become that nobody would seriously challenge what had clearly become a long-standing pattern. When I asked directly why the pool had been effectively closed to general use for the better part of the summer while her own family and guests continued using it regularly, her answer was that ongoing structural assessments and liability concerns had necessitated restricted access, and that she didn't feel it was appropriate to open the pool to general use until those concerns were fully resolved. An explanation that conveniently never seemed to prevent her own family from continuing to swim in the supposedly hazardous water. I want to introduce you to my neighbor, Farah Delacroix Conquo, who I mentioned this entire situation to over our shared fence line one evening, more out of frustrated venting than any real expectation that she'd have useful information. Farah, it turned out, worked in the county assessor's office, a role that gave her a particular kind of practical familiarity with property records that ended up mattering enormously once she offered, almost casually, to pull up our community's actual plat records out of simple curiosity about how the pool amenity area's ownership was structured. What Farah found, within about a day of checking, revealed something neither of us had expected going into this. The land where our community pool actually sat, according to the county's official plat and ownership records, was not designated as HOA common area at all. It had, at some point roughly 8 years earlier, during a complicated series of property transactions that predated Priscilla's own tenure on the board entirely, been transferred into an entity that Farah, digging slightly further, identified as a small private holding company, one that, per the state business registry, was solely owned by Priscilla Wentworth Ashby herself. I want to sit with what this actually meant, because it took both Farah and me a genuinely long moment to process it fully. The community pool that all 220 households paid annual dues specifically earmarked for maintaining, the pool everyone had always assumed was straightforward shared HOA property, sat on land that Priscilla personally owned through a private holding company, meaning her discretionary authority over its scheduling wasn't simply an aggressive interpretation of board power. It was, functionally, her exercising authority over a piece of land she genuinely did own privately, while the rest of the community continued paying dues under the assumption that this was shared common property they had equal rights to access. I want to walk you through how this transfer had apparently happened, because Farah's further digging over the following week uncovered the mechanism, and it revealed something considerably more troubling than a simple oversight in how the community's original common areas had been platted. About 8 years earlier, during a period when the community's original developer was still winding down its involvement, and the HOA board was transitioning to full resident control, a series of parcel adjustments had been filed, ostensibly to correct minor boundary discrepancies between the pool amenity area and an adjacent undeveloped lot. Buried within those adjustments, filed with minimal fanfare, and as far as either Farah or I could determine, without any broad resident notification or vote at the time, was a transfer moving the pool's actual underlying parcel out of the HOA's common area designation and into private ownership under an entity that, at the time of the transfer, had been newly formed by someone who, based on state registry filing dates, was Priscilla herself, several years before she ever ran for board president. Desmond, Farah told me, laying out the full paper trail across my kitchen table, I don't think this was an accident. This looks like Priscilla positioned herself to personally acquire the actual land under this community's pool years before she ever became board president, likely anticipating exactly the kind of long-term control this would eventually give her, and then simply waited until she held enough institutional position and trust within the community to actually start exercising that control without anyone questioning the underlying ownership closely enough to notice. I want to tell you about the decision I made sitting at that kitchen table, because it's the moment this stopped being a personal frustration about a closed pool and became something I understood needed to go to the entire community immediately. If Priscilla genuinely owned that land privately, every single dollar of HOA dues earmarked for pool maintenance over the preceding 8 years had been funding upkeep and improvements on property that legally belonged to her alone, an arrangement that, once fully understood, represented something considerably more serious than an unfair scheduling practice. That's where part 2 picks up, because what Farah and I discovered next, digging into exactly how those maintenance funds had actually been spent over those 8 years, revealed a scope to this situation that neither of us had anticipated, and set in motion a legal reckoning that would end with Priscilla Wentworth Ashby losing considerably more than just her board position. Farah and I spent the following 2 weeks requesting and reviewing 8 years of HOA financial records, specifically related to pool maintenance and improvement spending, a records request that, as an association member, I had a clear legal right to make regardless of how uncomfortable it might prove for the board. What those records showed, once Farah, with her professional familiarity with property and financial documentation, helped me actually parse them properly, was that the community had spent just over $110,000 over those 8 years on pool-related maintenance, repairs, and improvements, every single dollar of it directed toward maintaining and enhancing a piece of land that, per the county records Farah had already confirmed, belonged privately to Priscilla rather than to the association at all. I want to walk you through the specific improvements that money had funded, because several of them, once viewed through the lens of Priscilla's private ownership, took on a considerably different character than simple community amenity upkeep. A significant pool deck renovation about 5 years earlier, funded through a special assessment the membership had approved, believing it was investing in shared community property. A new pool heating system installed 3 years ago. Ongoing annual landscaping around the pool area, all of it, functionally, community-funded improvements to private property that Priscilla alone would benefit from should she ever choose to develop, sell, or otherwise dispose of that land independently of the HOA. I want to introduce you to the attorney Farah connected me with, a woman named Rosalind Kowalska Ferreira, who specialized in HOA governance disputes and had, as it turned out, handled a case with some structural similarities involving improperly transferred common area years earlier in a different community. Rosalind reviewed the county plat records, the business registry filings establishing Priscilla's ownership of the holding company, and the 8 years of HOA spending records, and told me within our first meeting that this was, in her professional assessment, one of the more serious cases of board self-dealing she'd encountered. This goes well beyond an unfair pool scheduling dispute, she told me. If the facts are what they appear to be, you have a board president who positioned herself to personally acquire community-designated land years before assuming leadership, then used her subsequent authority to direct over $100,000 in community funds toward improving property she owned privately, all while restricting the broader membership's access to what they reasonably believed was shared common property they were paying dues to maintain. This raises serious questions of breach of fiduciary duty, potential fraud in how the original parcel transfer was executed, and unjust enrichment given how much community money has flowed into private property value she alone stands to benefit from. Rosalind filed a formal legal complaint on behalf of the association, a complex case that required, first, establishing formal legal standing for the membership to challenge the original 8-year-old parcel transfer itself, arguing that it had been executed without proper resident notification or vote as required under the community's governing declaration for any disposition of common area property, a requirement that, per the declaration's own explicit language, Rosalind confirmed had clearly been bypassed during that original transaction. I want to walk you through the community meeting that followed, because unlike some more straightforward HOA disputes involving a single clear violation, this required considerably more careful explanation to a room full of residents who, understandably, needed time to fully absorb what they were being told. Rosalind presented the case methodically, starting with the county plat records establishing private ownership, moving through the business registry filings connecting that ownership directly to Priscilla, and finishing with the 8 years of financial records showing exactly how much community money had flowed into maintaining and improving that private property. I watched the room's reaction shift over the course of that presentation, from confused murmuring to a kind of stunned, quiet fury, dozens of residents realizing, in real time, that a special assessment they'd personally paid into 5 years earlier for that pool deck renovation had, in fact, funded improvements to land that had never belonged to the community at all. Priscilla, given the opportunity to respond, attempted initially to argue that the original parcel transfer had been a legitimate correction to a boundary discrepancy, handled properly through the developer transition process, an explanation that Rosalind dismantled by pointing directly to the declaration's explicit notification and voting requirements for any common area disposition. Requirements that the transfer's own filing date and lack of any corresponding meeting minutes or resident notification record, made clear, had simply never been followed. A longtime resident near the front of the room, someone who had actually served on the board during part of that original developer transition period 8 years earlier, stood up and said something that I think finally cemented the outcome of that meeting. "I was on this board when that transition happened," he said. "I don't remember any vote or notification about transferring the pool parcel to anyone. If that happened, it happened without the board I served on ever being properly informed either." The vote that followed authorized Rosalind to pursue full legal action seeking to void the original parcel transfer and restore the pool land to proper HOA common area ownership, to recover the community funds improperly spent maintaining and improving what had been, functionally, Priscilla's private property, and to immediately remove Priscilla from the board pending the outcome of that litigation. I want to walk you through how the case ultimately resolved, because it took nearly a year to fully work through, given the complexity of challenging an 8-year-old property transfer. Facing overwhelming documentary evidence, the clear declaration violation in how the original transfer bypassed required resident notification, and mounting pressure once the district attorney's office, alerted by Rosalind given the scale of potential fraud involved, began its own separate inquiry into the original transaction, Priscilla ultimately agreed to a comprehensive settlement rather than continue fighting a case that had grown increasingly difficult to defend. The settlement required Priscilla to formally transfer the pool parcel back into proper HOA common area ownership, permanently, with the transfer recorded and verified by the county to prevent any future ambiguity, to repay a substantial portion of the community funds that had gone toward improving what had been her private property, and to permanently forfeit any future eligibility for HOA board leadership within the community. I want to tell you about the day the pool reopened to full, unrestricted community access, properly designated now as genuine HOA common area with the ownership question permanently resolved, because I remember standing at the edge of that pool with Elian and Rowan, finally swimming in water that unambiguously belonged, in every legal sense, to the entire community rather than to any single family's private benefit, and feeling a particular kind of satisfaction that went beyond simply winning a dispute, a sense that something genuinely wrong, something that had been quietly extracting value from an entire neighborhood for the better part of a decade, had finally been fully corrected rather than simply papered over. If there's a lesson in this story, I think it's something Rosalind said to me during one of our early meetings, reviewing the original 8-year-old transfer documents for what felt like the 10th time. She said that the most dangerous HOA self-dealing schemes are often the ones built years in advance, quietly, through complex property transactions that most residents never think to scrutinize closely, precisely because they happen long before the person benefiting from them ever holds enough visible authority to draw suspicion. By the time Priscilla was actually restricting pool access in a way people noticed and questioned, the actual foundation of her control, private ownership of the underlying land itself, had already been sitting quietly in the county records for 8 full years, waiting for someone to simply think to check. We checked, and it turns out that one frustrated Saturday afternoon, watching my own kids splash in an undersized kiddie pool, one neighbor's casual professional familiarity with county property records, and 8 years of financial documentation that had been sitting in plain sight the entire time were more than enough to prove that Priscilla Wentworth Ashby's exclusive summer pool reservation had never really been about liability concerns or maintenance schedules at all, and to bring the water back to where it had always belonged, to everyone. Thumbnail text. She never owned the pool land.